Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video will be reviewing the adventure Manse of Special Purpose, designed by Jake Friday for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your DM's Guild shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. Shouts to Platinum patrons Andrew, Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Nick R, Andy, Chris, Manuel, Basil, Nick C, and Travis. And Gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy Numa, Marcos Did Vicente, Gilberto, Sean A.K., Cert 2B, Adam, Tethers Lounge, Sam, Ross, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, and Fatboy619. Thank you all very much for your support. So back when we could actually go to restaurants, because right now I'm recording this in the middle of the coronavirus, COVID-19 global pandemic still in July, I very rarely got a chance to go to seafood restaurants because family's not a big fan of seafood, and I am, and I don't get voted on to do it that often. But when I do, and it's a very special occasion, a lot of times I will order the sampler, which is it's several entrees put together. Usually it's like a big, you get for like an appetizer or something. They just put a bunch of kind of the whatever the restaurant signature dishes are in one big thing, and I'll get that as a freaking meal because I get seafood so rarely and I just want it all. The reason I'm making this analogy is that a Manse of Special Purpose is like having a sampler of the extra dimensional planes of the D&D lore. It's like the Feywild, the Shadowfell, the Layers of the Abyss. All of these are in this one, basically single dungeon that you could... It's not built as a one-shot, but you could almost design it as a one-shot because there's not a whole lot of combat included. It does a really cool thing with immersion. It paints a cool picture of what's going on here. It's a very well-worn premise. In fact, I just recently, not too long ago, reviewed another dungeon that had to do with a nobleman who dug too deep and doomed his family, and the adventurers had to come through, and the mansion itself was the dungeon. This is basically that exact same premise, only instead of it being any kind of like undead haunting or something like that, this one has to do with, I guess technically, the Far Realm, because there was an eldritch being that had broken through, the noble had researched and dug too deep, and basically this device that it turned on transformed entire sections of the mansion and the surrounding area, like turned the population into like animated furniture and animated golems and things, and put people like into the walls. It's just kind of really messed up looking and creepy. And then managed to make it so that when you walk into a room, it's like half of one different dimensional plane kind of taking over. So it's a really, really interesting way to design a dungeon. Unfortunately, that comes with a major caveat, and that is that there's no artwork in here whatsoever, and that includes maps. There's no maps either, which is a huge bummer. And I get that. I mean, the designer does say, hey, I want to use Theater of the Mind for this, and the nature of the dungeon design kind of lends itself to move away from a like traditional battle map because they're supposed to be very surreal, and some of them are maybe even MC Escher-esque when you walk in, and it's a lot of weirdness going on, and you might not be able to get that from a map, but still, it would help immensely, even if it was just a sketch or something for the DM to be able to see what's going on, because all of these, I mean, it's hard to even see if these rooms are properly interconnected, or if you're literally just supposed to shuffle the players from one room to the other. The idea here is, I think, instead of it making it a linear process, you kind of let them explore the mansion on their own, but I mean, there's still only like half a dozen rooms or so that have anything in it. Now, what I do like is that it's a very event-focused dungeon in that there are no like random encounters, there are no like dead-end rooms or anything like that you would normally see if you were looking at a traditional, top-down battle map of a dungeon. Instead, it's like, hey, here's what happens in the dining room, here's what happens in the laboratory, here's what happens in the library. And outside, the leading up action is very cool. Like you meet like an animated armor, which is a former like groundskeeper or something, and because everybody's been transformed. And you see a bunch of furniture attacking this house outside. You learn about what's going on inside this mansion where things have gone terribly wrong. So, on the one hand, it's a premise that I've seen a lot of, which is turning a noble mansion into a dark, creepy dungeon crawl, which that is this. But on the other hand, the planar stuff is pretty cool, and it does some fun stuff in there. For example, in the Shadowfell, the mother has been transformed into a vampire, and she wants to protect her child who's in this kind of death trap that you need to get to. There's a really weird thing in the Feywild where two of the kids... By the way, a lot of kids in danger in this one. That should be a content warning at the top of the adventure. I don't think there is one for that. It does mention the fact that you should be using the safety card system, which, yes, you probably should for all adventures in general if you don't know your players. But in terms of overall content warning, like, kids in peril for sure. And it's almost like Labyrinth-esque too. There's one of them that's the like a big giant sun, and one's a giant moon, and one can tell the truth and one can tell a lie, and it's this whole role-playing event. I mean, a lot of these scenes are basically role-playing focused, which is pretty cool to see. You could potentially make it all the way, I think, to the final boss. I think you have to fight the animated furniture scene in chapter 1. And then other than that, you can, I think, go through most of the actual dungeon and just kind of talk to people and solve the puzzles and things until you get to the very end, and I think then you have to fight the actual final boss. One of my favorites is there's a pit fiend in the game room, which is, of course, the one of the planes of hell, and you have to negotiate with the pit fiend. There's just really great role-playing notes on how to negotiate with them and what they're after and what you need from them and all of that. So it does a really good job of just immersing the players into this really... interesting situation and event, and there's some fun notes about playing up. You can play up the horror aspect, or you can kind of dial it down. One weird part is that it mentions at the beginning that there is separate box text for changing the tone to go either darker or lighter, and it says throughout the adventure we'll be using these these tone notes, which is an interesting concept that you can do that. I mean, obviously any DM can change it that way, but I like that the adventure even goes further and says, hey, we can make this as dark and weird as possible, or we can bring some moments of levity in here. But then there's only like 2 or 3 of these actual notes throughout. It doesn't quite capitalize on the actual idea that it had to begin with, which is being able to change all of these scenes to make them darker or lighter. For example, would there be a way to change it so there's not all these children in peril, for example, because that's kind of a major part of like half these rooms, which is a bit of a bummer there. Otherwise, I liked the written content. There were a few... I was very torn on whether to put grammar and sentence structure as a con, because it was just kind of right on my level of, is this not great or not. Overall, I did not do it. I didn't put it as a con. It definitely could have used an editor. I will say that. It could have used an editor to clean up some sentences, fix some areas that don't sound right. It also kind of gives off in certain parts a bit of a bloggy aspect to it, like the design, and it's just weird because it bounces back and forth. Otherwise, it seems pretty, a neutral tone throughout. And although every once in a while it'll be, for example, Zazelfor is of course interested in acquiring the player's souls. I mean the player character's souls. As someone who has sold his soul to 3 different people, I encourage this sort of metagaming. It's kind of weird to insert that first-person opinion, in the middle of this. Otherwise, everything was very straightforward and just kind of factual and telling about it. So it's a interesting style. I'll say that it's a little casual in parts, and the actual writing of it probably could have used an editors to go over and clean up some of these sentences a little bit. But ultimately, I wanted to mention that during the video review, but I'm not actually going to put that as an overall con like I did with the art. The final boss fight is really damn cool though, and usually I'm not a fan of final bosses that don't have any kind of minions or anything, but this thing is, and it doesn't have a CR or anything. It's just a complete custom creature that has inhabited the body of the person who caused all this, which, by the way, you find that person's decapitated head, because when this thing is drawn from, when it attaches itself to a host, it can basically cut off that person's head, but the head is still alive. I'm not sure what the rules are for that, but so you've got this really hilarious like NPC that you probably can't trust fully, and he was kind of behind a lot of these things, but he's also a head, so he can't he's not in a position to threaten or necessarily even be threatened. So I thought that was a really funny way of doing a potential NPC party member that can't really do anything. But the final boss has legendary actions that includes using one of the player character's own abilities, with a they have to roll a wisdom saving throw, or it can use like lay on hands or channel divinity or something, or it can tether itself, this is a con save, to another player character, to where anytime that it takes damage, that player character takes the same amount of damage. That's pretty fucking crazy. That's an ability in Divinity Original Sin, and it's an awesome ability. I forget what it's called there, but it's like this chain that you can see. That's a legendary action too. And then if it gets, as a reaction, it can actually teleport and switch places with somebody, and then that person takes the damage. And then when it gets low enough, it leaves its host body and then tries to possess another one. And then that involves, of course, some saves and checks. And worst case scenario, the player, of course, gets their head decapitated, which somehow also leaves them still alive. I wish there were a little more rules about what happens if you then defeat that person. Is it like the Greater Restoration thing that can heal them, or how does that work? But I mean, this is a tier 3 adventure. I hope I mentioned at the beginning. Even though there's not a lot of combat and the checks, and I guess some of the traps do a lot of damage, like it doesn't seem like you necessarily, it's not like a hard tier 3 or anything, because it's just a one dungeon experience, so everybody's decently fully rested at this point. So I'm glad that final boss is actually seems to be appropriately challenging and pretty fun to run, hopefully, but I would hesitate to always have any kind of boss fight that did not have any kind of minions. And this one does not appear to have any minions, so that's always a bit of a bummer. But the only real visual aids we get are some weird, there's this weird one of the room sequence at the end. Some of the puzzles don't quite work as well. I guess I'm just not a math person, but there's one that's supposed to be all about like math and knowing how to make a certain sequence to make this certain, I don't know, it was over my head. I'm not going to complain because I really liked having all these puzzles in here, but I would probably have to change this up if I was running it, because it confused the hell out of me as written, but I am not a numbers math kind of puzzle person at all. I do appreciate, and the only real appendix here, is a little flow chart, and it basically just lists all the different clues and information that players can learn from different areas, so that's at least pretty helpful, and it gives a nice just overview of what areas are there, what areas they need to go to, and as you can see, it's really not linear, and except for you have to complete the first area first, obviously, then the mansion itself, which is about 4 main rooms or areas or events, and then that unlocks this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think, 6 areas and events, and then that unlocks the final area, which is the final boss fight. So, I mean, overall, I think it's a thumbs up. I really wish we had some maps involved here, or some kind of art, or some visual aids at all, because it's a really interesting premise to be using all these multiplanar areas, but I hadn't seen anything that uses stuff like that, which is pretty fun, and it doesn't go into the trap of just like, well, we've got all these areas, so now you're gonna fight, I don't know, Feywild, you're gonna fight ghosts in the ethereal realm, and you're gonna fight gothic werewolves in the Shadowfell, and it's, instead of being a bunch of combat encounters, it's actually like events and storytelling and some puzzle sequences. It's all good stuff, basically. So I actually like that it doesn't at all focus on the combat aspect of D&D, but goes in a different direction. So pros and cons for a Manse of Special Purpose. I did want to mention before we go to the pros and cons, though, this title is horrible. It's bad. Manse is a very awkward word in the English language. We don't really use it very often to describe a mansion, which is the more common term. And special purpose is so infuriatingly vague. It could mean literally anything, and it sounds really bad in a title. So a Manse of Special Purpose is just a bad title. I'm not going to put it as a con. I just wanted to mention it right here. I think it's a bad title. There's so much interesting stuff going on in here. You could have picked any of those things to convey that it's somehow this far realm entity has come in, or the fact that there's all these multiplanar things, or the mansion itself has been warped into space time. Like, you can come up with all kinds of titles based on that, instead of this really, really vague bad title. So pros: excellent balance of exploration, role playing, and combat. The fact that it backpedals way away from combat, but still has that epic boss fight at the end, which is really fun. It's all about exploring this mansion and immersing yourself in what's going on, finding out the clues, the backstory of the horror, and being able to talk to a lot of things in the event. You can talk to the Deva in the celestial part, you can talk to the pit fiend in the hell part. Like, it's all about just conversing with stuff, which is cool. Pros, fun use of different planar realms and beings from D&D lore. I kind of just mentioned that, but it's a good use of all those creatures and things. Pros, epic final boss fight with unique abilities and stages. I did think that boss fight was really, really cool looking. Cons, no artwork whatsoever. You get that like flowchart and the little drawing of the final room, but otherwise there's nothing in there, and no maps whatsoever, which is another big bummer. So I get that they want to run Theater of the Mind. I don't run Theater of the Mind, and even if I did, I'd still want some kind of visualization of what these rooms look like, or even some kind of art. If you had artwork that would alleviate the map thing, it would still be a complaint for me personally, but that would help. Final verdict. Featuring an immersive dungeon full of memorable encounters, a Manse of special purpose is the appetizer sampler of extra planar adventures. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson, and you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.